All right, let's do it. Well, nice to meet you, everyone. I'm Kevin, co-founder and CTO here at Tecton. And in this chat, I'm going to shed some thoughts on how to think about picking the right online store for your feature store or for your ML platform. Quick recap, what's a feature store? I'm sure most of you know this already, but it is, at the end of the day, the interface between your data and your models. It serves real-time features to your models that are running in productions, that are making predictions, and then it also serves historical features to your model training. The way it does that is that a feature store typically doesn't just implement its own database. Instead, it abstracts access to an offline store and to an online store, depending on the usage. And in contrast to an offline store, the online store is used to serve features for online predictions. And it typically only serves the most recent feature value for a given entity. Also, typically, you only care about the feature value for one entity or for a handful of entities. Typically, the load can be quite high. It can literally get into the hundreds of thousands or millions of queries per second. The feature vector is quite small, a couple bytes, kilobytes in most use cases. And then finally, latency matters a lot for the online store. And basically, the offline store is the exact inverse because it powers your training that has completely different characteristics. But let's focus on the online store, and which one should you pick? Well, if you sample the universe of a couple of ML platforms and feature stores out there, you see a variety of different choices the company have made. One thing that stands out here is that a key value store is typically quite popular as a category of online store. And the most prominent and popular choices are typically that we see Cassandra, which we used at Uber, Redis, or DynamoDB. But as you try to figure out, hey, which one should I use for my own platform under the hood if I have to build my own? Here are a couple considerations that I think are really important to keep in mind. First one is, what does your team already know? What are they familiar with? What are the online stores you already have in your stack? If you bring something else in, of course, you're signing yourself up for a bunch of unknown unknowns, a potentially steep learning curve. Best avoid it if you can and already have a good system in place that you like. Second, figure out whether you want to invest the time and the resources to manage a store on your own, or whether you really prefer the luxury of having somebody else manage a store for you. In most cases, I would recommend going with a managed service so you don't have to waste any time and resources on having to manage your own. And of all the stores out there, we found DynamoDB to be pretty good. At Uber, we had an internal team that was fully dedicated to managing Cassandra clusters for the different consuming application teams, including the Michelangelo platform team. Next, of course, you want to look at, well, what's the latency requirement of your end-to-end ML prediction pipeline? And what's the budget you have available to fetch the features from your online store? And not just the median, but also what tail latencies can your use case stomach without deteriorating? Are you okay with up to 100 milliseconds? Or do you really need tens of milliseconds or maybe even less than that? Or does it not really matter whether you're at 100 milliseconds, 500, or even maybe a full second? If tail latencies really matter to you, we found that Redis outperformed in our benchmarks Dynamo in pretty much all cases. Next, of course, the read and the write load is super important to keep an eye on too, both today and what you expect to hit in the future. Do you have a use case that's extremely write heavy or extremely read heavy? Like, for instance, maybe you have a streaming feature that just hammers on the online store, which is something that you'll have to keep in mind as you look at the different options and especially their cost efficiency, which we'll look at in the next slide. Also, think about, well, do you only need to fetch individual rows and look those up for individual entities? Or do you need to submit more complex queries? Also, are you okay with eventual consistency, or do you require the typical ACID properties? For most use cases that we've seen, key value stores are the best option wherever you require only individual row lookups and you're fine with eventual consistency because they just perform in most cases significantly better than your typical relational database because they don't have the transaction schema, the locking overhead that you would find with those. And then finally, cost efficiency, extremely important because the pricing model of the different databases is typically can be super different. And the impact on the final cost of your system can literally be orders of magnitude different. Some stores, like DynamoDB, charges by writes and reads, where writes are significantly more expensive than the reads. Other databases only charge by the number of nodes that you have and their provisioning. And depending on your use case, one may be significantly cheaper than the other. And in our benchmarks, for instance, if you have a really write-heavy workload and it's pretty steady, Redis beats Dynamo in pretty much all cases. But if you have super sparse traffic and it's not super predictable and the load is fairly low, DynamoDB can be cheaper. And at Feast and at Tecton, we've run a few benchmarks. You can find more details on those on our website. And specifically what we did here was one high-scale benchmark where we ran 20,000 feature requests per second, each one of which fanned out to 10 different tables. So it hits the database with 200,000 requests per second. And I'll show you now what the results here look like between Redis and Dynamo. But first, disclaimer, this isn't a TPC approved benchmark. So this is just one representative benchmark of what we see our customers typically do with our feature stores. For this high scale use case, we found that Redis did outperform Dynamo, specifically on the tail latency. It performed really, really well. And the cost for this high scale, not super varied use case is significantly cheaper and different to Dynamo, which is why at the end of the day, we decided to integrate the Tecton and Feast with both Dynamo and Redis. So customers can really choose based on their use case and their feature, which one they want to use under the hood. Now, finally, I want to leave you with some quick rules of thumb as well. Typically, I'd recommend if you have a really high scale use case and tail latencies really matter, Redis is a pretty safe choice. If your load is super sparse and you care a lot about the management convenience, DynamoDB is a pretty good option. But if you care a lot about super strong consistency and complex search queries for like candidate generation use cases and stuff like that, Aurora is a pretty good option as well. But at the end, not all ML use cases are created equal, and it really depends on what you have. So ideally, you can federate out to not just one, but multiple stores. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
What's TPC stand for?
Oh, I don't even know the exact behind the scenes.
What does it mean though? Like it's just like actually approved by a third party?
Yeah, like a central not-for-profit organization that comes up with standardized benchmarks. The database is typically used to compare which one's more performant than the other.
Oh, somebody just put in the chat, transaction processing. All right, nice. And one more before we jump, and everyone that has questions, feel free to ask them in Slack. Feel free to jump over there in Slack. What I'm wondering is, do you see a lot of use cases where people are using multiple stores? Like they have multiple use cases and they're like, oh, well, because Redis is better performant in this use case, I'm going to use it. And then Aurora I need for those bulletproof use cases.
Typically, the companies we've spoken to right now, they typically have one store because that's the easiest way to get started with something. But we see now with our own customers, for instance, where we started with Dynamo, and for some high scale use cases, it's just cost prohibitive, which was why we're now giving them the option to, for that use case only, use Redis. But if you're just getting started and have a first ML platform or feature store, I probably wouldn't immediately implement federation.